The alarm on my ship screamed before I even understood what it was warning me about. I was young then, barely out of training, standing on the bridge of a Krizari cruiser called the Vantel Rest, when the sensors locked onto something that should not have existed. A single vessel, small by our standards, sitting silently at the edge of a dead system we had claimed 3 cycles earlier. My commander, an old and confident officer named Dravith Orn, laughed when he saw the readings. He said the vessel belonged to a species so new to space travel that our scouts had barely bothered to catalog them. He called them soft. He called them slow. He called them nothing worth our attention. I remember the name we had given them in our early reports, Terrans, a word that meant little to us at the time, just another entry in a long list of primitive cultures we assumed we would either absorb or erase. We had no fear of them. Why would we? Our fleet had conquered a dozen systems before I was even born. We had technology older than their entire recorded history. We had discipline bred into us for 100 generations, and they had one ship, alone, unarmed as far as our scans could tell, drifting near a dead colony that used to belong to us before we abandoned it for richer worlds. Commander Dravith ordered a boarding party to intercept and identify the vessel. I was assigned to the security detail, which meant I would be one of the first among my kind to see a human face. I did not know then that this moment would haunt me for the rest of my long life. I did not know that the memory of this day would return to me decades later, when I was old and gray and finally ready to speak of it. We approached slowly, weapons ready but lowered, following protocol for a first contact scenario. The human ship did not move. It did not power up its engines or attempt to flee. It simply waited, as if it had been expecting us, as if our arrival was not a surprise at all but a calculation already made. I remember thinking how strange that was. Every species we had encountered before reacted to our approach with some measure of fear or aggression. This ship did neither. It simply waited. When we opened a channel, a voice answered, calm, steady, a woman's voice, speaking in a language our translators struggled to parse at first, full of idioms and rhythms that did not match anything in our records. Her name, we would later learn, was Nora Whitfield, and she introduced herself not as a soldier or a diplomat, but as a surveyor, mapping old colony ruins for reasons she did not explain. She asked, politely, what our intentions were. Commander Dravith found this amusing. He told her, through the translator, that this system belonged to the Krizari Dominion, and that she was trespassing on sovereign territory. There was a pause on the other end of the channel, long enough that some of us wondered if the connection had failed. Then she spoke again, and her voice had not changed at all. Still calm, still steady. She said that Earth did not recognize claims made by force over territory that had once belonged to another species, and that she would be reporting our presence to her government. I did not understand the weight of those words then. None of us did. We saw a single unarmed ship, a lone woman speaking with a strange kind of confidence that seemed almost foolish given the size of our fleet compared to her vessel. Commander Dravith ordered her to power down and prepare to be boarded for questioning. She refused. Politely, but firmly, she refused. What happened next is burned into my memory more clearly than almost anything else in my long life. Commander Dravith, annoyed but not alarmed, sent a small craft to disable her ship's engines and force compliance. It was meant to be a simple operation, a demonstration of our superiority, nothing more. The small craft approached, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then the human ship's defenses activated, and our craft simply stopped working. No explosion, no dramatic display of force. It simply went dark, drifting, its systems fried by something we did not understand, and would not understand for a long time afterward. The bridge of the Vantel Rest fell silent. Commander Dravith's confidence cracked for the first time since I had known him. He ordered a full scan of the human vessel, hoping to find some weakness, some explanation for what had just happened. The scans came back strange. The ship's technology did not match anything in our records. It was not more advanced than ours in most ways. In some ways it was clearly less advanced, but it had been built with a philosophy we did not recognize, one that prioritized survival and adaptability over raw power. The woman's voice returned to the channel. She said, still calm, that she would prefer we did not attempt that again. She said her government would likely send someone to discuss the matter properly, and that in the meantime, she intended to continue her survey work undisturbed. There was no anger in her voice, no fear, just a strange, quiet patience that unsettled everyone on that bridge more than any threat could have. Commander Dravith, his pride wounded, made the decision that would change the course of my entire life and the fate of our empire. He ordered the Vantel Rest to open fire on the human vessel, intending to destroy it outright and remove the embarrassment from our records before anyone in the Dominion command structure heard about it. I remember the order being given. I remember the weapons officer hesitating, just for a moment, before complying. Our cannons fired. The human ship's defenses held. Not perfectly, not without visible strain, but they held long enough for something inside that vessel to respond in a way we did not expect. A single return shot, precise and calculated, struck one of our primary systems and disabled it instantly. We had assumed we were dealing with a defenseless survey ship. We were wrong. It had been armed the entire time, quietly, patiently, waiting to see if it would need to prove that fact. The exchange lasted only a few minutes before the human vessel used the confusion to power up its engines and retreat into the depths of the system, vanishing from our sensors in a way that should not have been possible with the technology we believed it possessed. Commander Dravith ordered pursuit, but by the time our secondary ships arrived, there was nothing left to find. The human ship was gone, along with any illusions we had about the nature of the species we had just encountered. I remember standing on that bridge, watching the empty space where the human vessel had been, feeling a coldness settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. Something about that exchange felt wrong, in a way I could not name. We had faced hostile species before. We had faced desperate ones, angry ones who fought with everything they had because they believed it was their only option. This was different. The woman on that ship had not been desperate or angry. She had been calm the entire time, even while defending herself, even while retreating. It was as if the entire encounter had been, for her, nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Commander Dravith filed his report that evening, and I remember the careful way he worded it, minimizing the encounter, describing it as a border dispute with a minor unknown species. He did not mention the disabled craft, or the precision of the human ship's counterattack. He did not mention the strange calm in the woman's voice, or the fact that she had warned us, politely, before defending herself. I think, looking back, he understood on some level that what had happened was not a small thing, even if he was not yet ready to admit it to himself or to his superiors. I was not able to forget it so easily. That night, alone in my quarters, I found myself replaying the woman's words over and over. She had said her government would likely send someone to discuss the matter properly. Not a fleet, not a war party. Someone to discuss the matter. As if the destruction of one of our craft and the humiliation of one of our commanders was simply a diplomatic inconvenience, to be smoothed over with conversation, rather than conflict. We did not know then how right she was, or how wrong we were to dismiss the significance of what her words truly meant. We did not know that this single encounter, this brief and almost bloodless skirmish at the edge of a dead colony system, was the first thread in a story that would unravel everything we believed about our place in the galaxy. We did not know that the calm in her voice was not a lack of understanding about the danger she was in, but a complete and total understanding of exactly how capable she and her people were of handling it. In the cycles that followed, reports began trickling in from other border systems, small encounters mostly. Survey ships like the one we had confronted, scattered across territories we considered ours by right of conquest. Each report followed a similar pattern. A human vessel, alone or in a small group, encountered by our forces and treated with the same dismissive confidence Commander Dravith had shown. Each encounter ended the same way. Our forces underestimated what they were facing, acted with aggression born of arrogance, and came away having learned nothing, except that this species was more capable than expected. I was reassigned 3 cycles later to a larger vessel, part of a growing fleet presence, along what we now understood to be the outer edge of human territory. By then, the mood among our command staff had shifted from dismissive amusement to a kind of nervous curiosity. Reports of human capabilities varied wildly, some contradicting others entirely. Some said their ships were slow and their weapons weak. Others said their tactics were unpredictable, in ways that made conventional strategy useless against them. No one seemed to agree on what exactly we were dealing with, and that uncertainty, more than any single report, was what began to unsettle even the most confident among our officers. I remember a briefing where an intelligence officer presented findings gathered from the scattered encounters. She described human ships built with redundant systems, designed to keep functioning even after significant damage. She described a species that seemed to value adaptability over raw strength, willing to retreat when necessary, but never truly giving up ground they considered important. She described communications intercepted from human vessels, filled with a strange mixture of formality and humor that our translators struggled to fully capture. Conversations between crew members that shifted from serious tactical discussion to light-hearted jokes within the same breath. None of us understood yet what this meant. We were still thinking in terms of strength and weakness, of superior technology and inferior technology, of the kind of hierarchies that had defined every conflict we had ever fought. We did not yet understand that we were facing something that did not fit neatly into those categories. A species whose greatest weapon was not a piece of equipment or a tactical formula, but something harder to define, something woven into the very way they thought and fought and lived. The first true battle, the one that would prove beyond any doubt what we were truly facing, was still cycles away. But looking back now, from the distance of so many years, I can see the shape of it forming, even in those early days. The calm voice on that first channel, the precision of that first counterattack, the strange, unshakable confidence that ran through every human encounter our forces reported. It was all there from the very beginning, waiting for us to understand it, waiting for us to learn the lesson that would eventually bring our entire empire to its knees. I did not know, standing on that bridge as a young officer, that I had just witnessed the opening moment of a war that would reshape the galaxy. I did not know that the woman whose calm voice still echoes in my memory, decades later, represented something our species had never encountered before, and would struggle for years to understand. I only knew that something had changed that day. Some fundamental assumption about the order of things had been quietly and permanently broken, and that nothing that came after would ever let us forget it. Commander Dravith was eventually reassigned to a quieter post, his reputation quietly damaged by an incident his superiors chose not to examine too closely. I never saw him again after that posting. I often wonder if he ever came to understand what he had truly encountered that day, or if he went to his end still believing it had been nothing more than an unfortunate skirmish with an overconfident scout ship. I know better now. I have known better for a very long time. That was not an overconfident scout ship. That was the first quiet warning of a storm that our entire civilization was not prepared to weather, and we were far too arrogant, in those early days, to listen. The tale I am about to tell you next is the one that truly opened our eyes, the one that took the strange unease from that first encounter and turned it into something closer to genuine fear. It happened not long after, in a system many of you have likely never heard of, and it involved a single human vessel that should have had no chance at all against the force sent to destroy it. What happened instead changed the way every officer in our fleet thought about this new enemy, and it changed something in me as well. Something that never fully returned to what it had been before. The system was called HFY Hollow, a small cluster of mining outposts we had claimed only a few cycles earlier. I was serving aboard a larger vessel by then, the Calvorn Sun, part of a task force sent to investigate reports of a single human ship operating in the area. Our commanders expected an easy resolution. One ship, they said, 16 of ours against one of theirs. It seemed almost unfair to call it a battle at all. I remember some of the younger crew members joking about it beforehand, wondering if the human ship would even bother to fight before retreating. I was not among those who joked. Something about the way that first encounter at the dead colony system had unfolded stayed with me, a quiet warning I could not shake, even as everyone around me treated this new mission with casual confidence. I kept thinking about the calm voice on that channel, about the precision of that single counterattack. I did not share these thoughts with anyone. I simply watched, and waited, and hoped that this time would be different. It was not different. It was worse. We found the human ship near the edge of the mining cluster, already damaged from what our sensors suggested was an earlier skirmish, with local defense systems left behind by the previous owners of the outposts. It should have been an easy target. Its hull showed visible scarring. Its power readings fluctuated in ways that suggested serious internal damage. Our task force commander, a seasoned officer named Threll Vashon, ordered a standard encirclement maneuver, surrounding the vessel to cut off any possibility of retreat before demanding its surrender. The human ship did not respond to our hailing signals. This did not surprise us. We assumed its communication systems had been damaged along with everything else we could see. Commander Threll ordered a final warning broadcast, giving the crew a chance to abandon ship before we opened fire. There was still no response, and so, following protocol, we began our attack. What happened over the next several minutes has stayed with me more vividly than almost any other memory from my long career. The human ship, despite its visible damage, despite being surrounded by 16 vessels each individually more powerful than itself, did not attempt to flee. It did not power down and surrender. Instead, its remaining weapon systems activated, and it began firing back with a precision that seemed almost impossible given the state of its hull. I watched from the tactical station aboard the Calvorn Sun as one of our support cruisers took a direct hit to its primary power core and went dark within seconds. The crew of that human ship, badly outnumbered and clearly dying, had targeted not the nearest vessel or the most obvious threat, but the one ship in our formation whose loss would create the most confusion in our command structure. It was not a lucky shot. It was a calculated one, made by someone who understood our formation better than we understood our own vulnerabilities in that moment. Commander Threll, visibly shaken but still confident in our numerical advantage, ordered a full coordinated strike, hoping to end the engagement quickly before further losses could occur. The human ship took hit after hit, its hull integrity failing in visible sections, its power output dropping steadily toward nothing. Any reasonable observer would have expected it to break apart or lose all combat capability within moments. It did not. It kept firing, its shots growing less precise but no less determined, striking whatever targets remained within its reach, even as its own systems failed around it. I remember hearing fragments of intercepted communication from the dying vessel, translated in real time by our systems, and relayed to the bridge. There was no panic in those voices. There was no pleading for mercy or desperate attempt at surrender. Instead, I heard what sounded like coordination, calm instructions being given, even as the ship's systems failed one by one, crew members apparently working to keep whatever weapons remained functional for as long as possible. At one point, I heard a voice, a man's voice, calling out numbers and directions with the same steady tone someone might use to give directions to a nearby location. There was no fear in it. There was only focus. The ship took 3 more of our vessels before its systems finally failed completely, going dark and silent, drifting lifeless in the space where the battle had taken place. 3 ships, each crewed by dozens of my kind, destroyed or severely disabled by a single vessel that our own sensors had identified as critically damaged before the engagement even began. Commander Threll ordered a final strike to ensure the human ship posed no further threat, and it was destroyed completely, ending the engagement. We had won, in the most technical sense of the word. We had eliminated the enemy vessel and secured the mining cluster. But I remember the silence on the bridge of the Calvorn Sun in the aftermath, a silence that had nothing to do with victory, and everything to do with a slowly dawning horror that none of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. 16 ships against 1, 3 of ours destroyed or crippled. A crew of perhaps a few dozen humans, already dying, choosing to keep fighting until the very end, rather than surrender or flee. I did not understand it then, and I confess that even now, after everything I have learned since, there is a part of it I still do not fully understand. In our own culture, in the culture of the Krizari Dominion, surrender in the face of overwhelming odds was not considered a failure. It was considered wisdom. A commander who fought to the last against impossible odds, sacrificing an entire crew for no strategic gain, would have been remembered not as a hero, but as a fool who wasted lives that could have been preserved through tactical retreat. The humans did not seem to share this understanding. Or perhaps, and this is a thought that has troubled me for many years, perhaps they understood something we did not. Perhaps they understood that the manner in which a battle is fought, even a battle that cannot be won, carries a weight and a meaning beyond simple survival. I do not know if I believe this fully even now, but I have come to respect it in a way I never expected to when I was young. After the battle, our intelligence officers recovered what they could from the wreckage of the human vessel, hoping to learn more about the crew who had fought so fiercely against such impossible odds. What they found troubled everyone who examined it. Personal effects. Photographs. Though we did not understand the significance of these images until much later. Written records. Difficult for our translators to parse fully. That suggested the crew of that ship had known from the moment of the initial skirmish that reinforcement was unlikely to arrive in time. They had known, in other words, that their situation was likely hopeless well before we ever arrived to finish the engagement. And they had chosen to keep fighting anyway. I remember a conversation I had afterward with a fellow officer, a communications specialist named Irena Kost, who had been listening to the intercepted transmissions throughout the entire battle. She told me something that stayed with me for the rest of my career. She said that in the final moments before the ship went silent, she heard laughter. Not hysteria, not the sound of minds breaking under pressure, but genuine laughter, brief and quiet, shared between two voices, just before the connection cut out entirely. She could not explain it, neither could I. Neither, I think, could any of us who had witnessed that battle and tried afterward to make sense of what we had seen. Commander Threll's report to Fleet Command was far more detailed than Commander Draveth's had been after the first encounter. He did not minimize what had happened. He described, in careful and precise language, a species that fought without regard for the odds against them, that seemed to draw some kind of strength or resolve from circumstances that should have produced despair. He recommended, in the strongest terms available to him, that Fleet Command reconsider its assessment of human capabilities and begin treating any future encounters with significantly greater caution. I do not know how seriously that recommendation was taken at the highest levels of our command structure. I know that in the cycles that followed, our approach to human territory shifted, becoming more cautious, more deliberate, though never quite cautious enough given what we would eventually learn about the true scope of what we were facing. I know that the battle at Ferry Hollow became something of a legend among our fleet crews, spoken about in quiet tones during long stretches between assignments, a story that grew more unsettling with each retelling, rather than less. For me personally, that battle marked the moment when my understanding of this new enemy shifted from curiosity to something closer to genuine unease. I had seen, with my own eyes, a single dying ship inflict losses on us that should have been impossible, given the disparity in our forces. I had heard, through intercepted communication, a crew facing certain destruction respond not with panic, but with calm coordination, and, somehow, even laughter. I did not have the words for what I was feeling in those days. I have more of them now, after decades of reflection, but even now the feeling itself remains difficult to fully capture. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from facing an enemy who is simply stronger than you, but from facing an enemy whose fundamental way of understanding conflict is different from your own, in ways you cannot fully predict or prepare for. This is the fear that began to take root in me after Ferry Hollow, and it would only grow deeper as the cycles passed and our encounters with humanity became more frequent, more significant, and ultimately, more devastating for everything my people had built. I did not know, standing on the bridge of the Calvorn Sun in the aftermath of that battle, that we had only begun to understand the smallest fraction of what we were truly facing. I did not know that the calm coordination I had heard in those final transmissions, the strange laughter that unsettled Irena so deeply, was not an anomaly but a pattern that would repeat itself again and again in the cycles to come. I only knew that something had shifted permanently in the way I understood the galaxy and our place within it, and that the confidence I had carried since childhood, the assumption that our dominion was simply superior to the lesser species we encountered, had cracked in a way that would never fully heal. The next tale I will share with you took place not in the vacuum of space, but on solid ground, in a place my people had once called Basran Outpost. It is a story that still visits me in quiet moments, decades later, more than perhaps any other memory from that entire conflict. It is the story of what we found when we returned to a listening post we believed we had lost to a small and insignificant human raiding party, and what that discovery taught us about the true nature of the war we had unknowingly begun. By the time we reached Basran Outpost, I had transferred to ground operations, a decision I made partly out of a desire to understand this new enemy in a way that space combat alone could not offer me, I had spent 2 cycles training with a specialized retrieval unit, tasked with recovering personnel and equipment from compromised positions along the ever-shifting border between our territory and the space humanity now openly claimed as its own. Basran Outpost had been a small listening post, tucked into the rocky terrain of a moon with a thin, barely breathable atmosphere. It monitored communications traffic in a nearby system and served as an early warning station in case of exactly the kind of incursion we now believed had taken place. We received the distress signal 3 days before my unit arrived, a brief and garbled transmission that cut off before any details could be confirmed. Fleet Command assumed the worst and assumed, based on the small size of the facility and its minimal defenses, that whatever force had taken it must have been similarly small. I remember the briefing before we deployed. Our unit commander, a steady and experienced officer named Belric On, told us to expect a straightforward recovery operation. Enemy forces, likely no more than a dozen based on transport signatures detected before the signal cut out, holding a facility staffed by perhaps 30 of our own personnel. He expected minimal resistance, given our numbers, and briefed us on standard protocols for retaking a compromised installation. Nothing about what we found matched that briefing. We approached the outpost under cover of the moon's long night cycle, moving carefully across terrain that offered little in the way of shelter. I remember the tension in my chest as we neared the perimeter, weapons ready, expecting resistance at any moment. There was none. The outer defenses, simple automated turrets meant to deter casual incursions, sat silent and dark, their systems disabled with what our engineers later determined was surgical precision, minimal damage inflicted, just enough to render them useless, without triggering the kind of destruction that would have alerted anyone still inside. The facility itself was eerily quiet as we breached the main entrance. No sounds of ongoing conflict, no sign of the human raiding party we expected to find still occupying the position. Commander Belric ordered a careful sweep, room by room, and it was during this sweep that we began to understand the true scale of what had happened at Basran Outpost. We found our people first in the main communications room, and I remember the wave of relief that passed through our unit at the sight of them still alive, still breathing, gathered together in a corner of the room, under what appeared to be minimal restraint. That relief did not last long. As we moved closer, offering assurances that they were safe now, that we had come to retrieve them, I began to notice something deeply wrong in the way they looked at us. Their eyes held a kind of hollow, distant quality that I had never seen before, not even in soldiers who had survived difficult battles. They did not celebrate our arrival. Several of them flinched at the sound of our voices. It took considerable time and patience from Commander Belric, who had experience with psychological trauma from earlier conflicts, to get any of them to speak coherently about what had happened. By the time we reached Basran Outpost, I had transferred to ground operations, a decision I made partly out of a desire to understand this new enemy in a way that space combat alone could not offer me. I had spent 2 cycles training with a specialized retrieval unit, tasked with recovering personnel and equipment from compromised positions along the ever-shifting border between our territory and the space humanity now openly claimed as its own. Basran Outpost had been a small listening post, tucked into the rocky terrain of a moon, with a thin, barely breathable atmosphere. It monitored communications traffic in a nearby system, and served as an early warning station in case of exactly the kind of incursion we now believed had taken place. We received the distress signal 3 days before my unit arrived, a brief and garbled transmission that cut off before any details could be confirmed. Fleet Command assumed the worst and assumed, based on the small size of the facility and its minimal defenses, that whatever force had taken it must have been similarly small. I remember the briefing before we deployed. Our unit commander, a steady and experienced officer named Belric On, told us to expect a straightforward recovery operation. Enemy forces, likely no more than a dozen based on transport signatures detected before the signal cut out, holding a facility staffed by perhaps 30 of our own personnel. He expected minimal resistance, given our numbers, and briefed us on standard protocols for retaking a compromised installation. Nothing about what we found matched that briefing. We approached the outpost under cover of the moon's long night cycle, moving carefully across terrain that offered little in the way of shelter. I remember the tension in my chest as we neared the perimeter, weapons ready, expecting resistance at any moment. There was none. The outer defenses, simple automated turrets meant to deter casual incursions, sat silent and dark, their systems disabled with what our engineers later determined was surgical precision. Minimal damage inflicted, just enough to render them useless without triggering the kind of destruction that would have alerted anyone still inside. The facility itself was eerily quiet as we breached the main entrance. No sounds of ongoing conflict, no sign of the human raiding party we expected to find, still occupying the position. Commander Belrick ordered a careful sweep, room by room, and it was during this sweep that we began to understand the true scale of what had happened at Basran Outpost. We found our people first in the main communications room, and I remember the wave of relief that passed through our unit at the sight of them still alive, still breathing, gathered together in a corner of the room under what appeared to be minimal restraint. That relief did not last long. As we moved closer, offering assurances that they were safe now, that we had come to retrieve them, I began to notice something deeply wrong in the way they looked at us. Their eyes held a kind of hollow, distant quality that I had never seen before, not even in soldiers who had survived difficult battles. They did not celebrate our arrival. Several of them flinched at the sound of our voices. It took considerable time and patience from Commander Belrick, who had experience with psychological trauma from earlier conflicts, to get any of them to speak coherently about what had happened. The story that emerged, pieced together over the following hours, was one that none of us were prepared to hear. The human raiding party had numbered only 4, not the dozen we had anticipated based on transport signatures that we later learned had been deliberately falsified to mislead any response force. 4 humans against 30 of our trained personnel, in a facility equipped with functioning defenses and standard weapons. By any reasonable measure, this should have been an easy defense for our people to mount. It was not. The 4 humans had entered not through the main defenses but through a maintenance access point that our own engineers had flagged as a minor vulnerability months earlier, a vulnerability that had never been addressed due to budget constraints that seemed almost absurd in hindsight given what it ultimately cost us. They moved through the facility with what our surviving personnel described as unsettling patience, disabling systems one at a time rather than announcing their presence with an obvious assault, isolating small groups of our people before they had any chance to coordinate a unified response. One of the survivors, a young technician named Pralis Ven, described watching 2 of her colleagues attempt to raise an alarm, only to find that the human intruders had somehow anticipated exactly which systems they would try to use and had disabled them hours in advance. She described the growing sense of dread that spread through the facility as personnel realized they were being systematically isolated and outmaneuvered by a force a fraction of their own size, using methods that seemed to anticipate their every response before they made it. The confrontations themselves, when they finally happened, were described by survivors in fragments, memories clearly still difficult for them to process fully. What struck me most, listening to these accounts, was not any single detail of what had occurred, but the consistent thread running through all of them, a description of the human intruders as calm and almost businesslike in their approach, using improvised tools and traps built from the facility's own equipment turned against its defenders, moving with a kind of confidence that suggested they had trained extensively for exactly this kind of engagement. By the end of the encounter, our facility had been completely secured by 4 individuals, without a single fatality among our personnel, a fact that initially struck me as strange, given everything else I had learned about human engagements up to that point. It was not until later, speaking privately with Commander Belrick, that I began to understand why this particular detail was perhaps the most unsettling of the entire incident. The humans had not killed anyone. They had the opportunity, repeatedly, throughout the encounter, and our surviving personnel confirmed this in their accounts. Instead, they had disabled, restrained, and ultimately left our people largely unharmed, occupying the facility for nearly 2 full days before withdrawing entirely, taking with them select pieces of equipment and data they clearly considered valuable, and leaving everything else, including our own personnel, exactly as they had found them. Commander Belrick believed, and I have come to agree with him over the many years since, that this was not mercy in any conventional sense. It was a message, deliberate and calculated, meant to demonstrate to our command structure exactly how completely we had been outmaneuvered, and to do so in a way that would leave living witnesses capable of describing every detail of their own defeat. A destroyed facility with no survivors tells a story of tragedy. A facility left intact, its defenders alive but thoroughly humiliated, tells a very different and in some ways more unsettling story about the capabilities of the force that accomplished it. I spent several additional days at Basran Outpost as part of the recovery and investigation team, and during that time, I had the opportunity to review recorded footage the humans had apparently allowed our automated systems to continue capturing throughout their occupation, footage that our engineers later determined had not been tampered with in any way. Watching that footage remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my entire career. I watched 4 individuals move through our facility with a level of coordination that seemed almost telepathic in its precision, communicating through brief gestures and glances rather than words, anticipating each other's movements without visible signals. I watched them handle our restrained personnel with what could only be described as careful professionalism, checking on their well-being at regular intervals, even as they systematically stripped the facility of anything they considered useful. I watched one of them, a woman whose name we would later learn was Grace Ellison, spend several minutes speaking quietly with one of our injured technicians, apparently offering basic medical assistance despite the obvious risk this posed to her own position. I remember showing this footage to Irena Cost, the communications specialist who had shared with me the story of the laughter she heard during the battle at Farai Hollow. She watched it in silence for a long time before speaking. She said that what disturbed her most was not the competence of the human raiders, though that competence was considerable, but the apparent normalcy with which they carried out an operation that any reasonable military doctrine would classify as extraordinarily high risk. 4 against 30. Deep in contested territory, with no visible support and no clear path to reinforcement if things went wrong. And yet nothing in their body language, their coordination, or their apparent decision-making suggested they considered this situation to be anything other than a standard operation, well within the bounds of acceptable risk. This, I have come to believe, is one of the central truths about humanity that took our people the longest to understand and accept. What we considered extraordinary risk, bordering on reckless disregard for survival, humans seem to consider simply the normal cost of doing what needed to be done. This was not recklessness in the way we understood the term. It was something closer to a fundamentally different calculation of acceptable risk, one built on capabilities and training that made scenarios we considered nearly suicidal into operations that, for them, carried reasonable odds of success. Commander Belrick's final report on the Basran Outpost incident became required reading for every ground operations officer in our sector within a matter of weeks. It marked a significant shift in how our military command approached the growing conflict with humanity, moving away from assumptions of numerical superiority as a guarantee of safety, and toward a much more cautious doctrine that acknowledged, however reluctantly, that we were facing an opponent whose capabilities could not be measured through conventional metrics alone. For me, personally, the memory of Basran Outpost represents something deeper than simple military lessons about troop numbers and defensive vulnerabilities. It represents the moment when I truly began to understand that the humans we were fighting did not conform to any framework I had been raised to understand conflict through. They were not driven by desperation or hatred in the way our own historical adversaries had often been. They approached even deeply dangerous operations with a kind of calm professionalism that felt, in its own way, more unsettling than any display of aggression could have been. I think often of Grace Ellison, kneeling beside our injured technician in that footage, offering quiet reassurance in a language he barely understood, even as she and her companions completed an operation that had left our entire facility humiliated and exposed. I do not know what became of her in the years that followed. I do not know if she survived the war that grew from that early conflict into something far larger and more devastating than anyone could have predicted in those early days. But I have never forgotten the image of her calm, careful hands, and the strange contradiction it represented, a warrior capable of outmaneuvering 30 trained defenders with only 3 companions, who still paused to ensure a wounded enemy received basic care before she and her team disappeared back into the darkness they had come from. The tale that follows this one is perhaps the most personal of everything I have shared with you so far, because it is the story of what happened when I myself was captured by a human boarding party, deep in a conflict that had by then grown far beyond the isolated skirmishes of those early days. It is the story of what I witnessed while held among them, and how that experience changed, more than any battle report or recovered footage ever could, my understanding of exactly who and what we had been fighting against all along. My capture happened during what should have been a routine patrol along a contested border corridor, nearly 4 cycles after the discovery at Basran Outpost. By this point in the conflict, our fleet had adopted much more cautious protocols, and I had been promoted to a mid-ranking position aboard a patrol cruiser called the Saren Watch, tasked with monitoring shipping lanes that both our people and humanity claimed rights to use. The engagement that led to my capture began with what our sensors identified as a small human transport vessel, seemingly unarmed, drifting near the edge of a debris field left over from an earlier conflict in the region. Our commander, having learned hard lessons from encounters like the one at HFY Hollow, ordered extreme caution as we approached, treating the vessel as a potential threat, regardless of its apparent lack of weapons. Our caution was not enough. The transport vessel had been a decoy, positioned deliberately to draw our attention, while a much smaller and better concealed human craft approached from within the debris field itself, using the wreckage to mask its approach from our sensors. By the time we detected the second vessel, it had already achieved a firing position that our defensive systems could not adequately counter. A precise strike disabled our primary engines, and within minutes, a boarding team had breached our hull. I remember the chaos of those first moments vividly, the sound of alarms, the shouted orders from officers, trying to organize a defense against an enemy already inside our ship. I was stationed near the secondary control room when the boarding party reached my position, and I remember making the decision, in that moment, that resistance would accomplish nothing except my own destruction. I lowered my weapon and raised my hands, expecting, based on everything our propaganda and our fears had taught me to expect, that this would be the end of my story, one way or another. It was not the end. It was, in many ways, the true beginning of my understanding. The human soldier who took me into custody was a man named Ethan Marlowe, and I remember being struck, even in that first terrifying moment, by the absence of the aggression I had expected. He did not strike me or shout at me in the way I imagined a triumphant enemy soldier might. He simply secured my restraints with efficient, practiced movements, and directed me, in surprisingly clear translated speech, to remain calm and follow instructions, assuring me that I would not be harmed if I cooperated. I was held, along with several other members of my crew who had also surrendered rather than fight to the last, in a section of the human vessel that had clearly been prepared in advance for exactly this purpose. It was not luxurious, but it was not the kind of grim holding cell I had imagined either. We were given adequate space, basic provisions suited to our biology, and access to communication that allowed us to speak with each other, though not with anyone outside the ship. What I witnessed during my time aboard that vessel, which lasted just under 2 weeks before an exchange was arranged through diplomatic channels, changed something fundamental in how I understood the people we had been fighting. I want to describe this carefully, because I believe it captures something essential about humanity that no battle report could ever fully convey. The crew of that ship operated with a kind of easy familiarity that seemed at odds with everything I understood about military discipline. I would hear them joking with each other during quiet moments, sharing what I gathered were humorous stories from their lives before the war, laughing in ways that seemed completely genuine and unguarded. And yet, within moments of an alert sounding, that same casual atmosphere would vanish entirely, replaced by a focused intensity and coordination that reminded me uncomfortably of the crew that had fought so fiercely at HFY Hollow. I remember one evening, if the ship's internal cycle could be called that, when Ethan Marlowe came to check on our holding area, as he did regularly throughout my captivity. I had by then developed enough understanding of the human language to attempt basic conversation, and I asked him, somewhat hesitantly, why his crew seemed to move so easily between laughter and what I could only describe as readiness for violence. I remember his answer clearly, even now, because it was delivered without any hesitation, as if the question itself was strange to him. He said that if his crew could not find moments of joy between the difficult parts of their duty, they would not be able to continue doing that duty for very long. He said that the difficult moments were real and heavy, but that refusing to let them consume every moment was not disrespect toward the seriousness of their situation. It was, in his words, a kind of survival that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. I did not fully understand this explanation at the time, and I confess that even now, after everything I have experienced since, there is a part of it that remains difficult for me to fully internalize. In the culture I was raised within, seriousness and levity were treated as separate and largely incompatible states. A soldier who laughed too easily was viewed with suspicion, as someone who did not take the gravity of their responsibilities seriously enough. Humans, I came to understand during my captivity, held no such division. They seemed capable of holding both at once, grief and humor, fear and calm, in a way that our own culture had no framework for. I witnessed something else during those 2 weeks that troubled me even more deeply, in a way I still struggle to fully articulate. One of my fellow captives, an engineer from my own ship named Voskin Yell, had been injured during the initial boarding action, a wound to his side that, while not immediately life-threatening, required ongoing care. I watched, over the course of several days, as members of the human crew took turns checking on his condition, adjusting his treatment based on what limited medical knowledge they had of our biology, and speaking to him with a gentleness that seemed completely genuine, despite the fact that he was, by every definition that mattered, their enemy. I remember asking Voskin, once he had recovered enough to speak comfortably, how this treatment made him feel. He told me it was the most confusing experience of his entire life. He said that everything in his training had prepared him for the possibility of capture ending in suffering, or worse, and that the kindness he received instead felt almost more disorienting than cruelty would have. He said he found himself wondering, in quiet moments, whether this kindness was itself a kind of weapon, a deliberate strategy to unsettle captured enemies in ways that harsh treatment never could. I have thought about that question many times in the years since, and I no longer believe it was a deliberate strategy in the way Voskin feared. I believe, based on everything I observed during my captivity and everything I learned about humanity in the years that followed, that the kindness we received was simply an authentic expression of how they understood the treatment of captured enemies who no longer posed a threat. This was not weakness. I want to be very clear about that, because it took me a long time to understand the distinction myself. It was a kind of strength that our culture had never taught us to recognize as strength at all. There was a night, near the end of my captivity, when the ship came under attack from a patrol that I later learned belonged to a different faction within the Dominion, one still operating in the region, despite the general withdrawal our forces had begun in that sector. I remember the alert sounding, the crew moving with practiced urgency to their stations, and Ethan Marlowe pausing briefly at our holding area to assure us that we would be moved to a more secure section of the ship for our own safety during the engagement. I watched, through a viewing port I was permitted limited access to, as that crew fought off an attacking force nearly twice their size, using the same combination of precision and unpredictable tactics I had heard described in every account I had gathered since that first encounter at the Dead Colony system, so many cycles earlier, and I heard, once again, in the aftermath of a battle that had clearly cost them something, based on the tension in their voices over the ship's internal communications, that same strange sound that Urena Cost had described to me after Farai Hollow. Laughter, brief and quiet, shared between exhausted voices, a release of tension that seemed to exist alongside genuine grief rather than in place of it. When the exchange was finally arranged and I was returned to Dominion territory, I remember struggling to explain to my debriefing officers exactly what I had witnessed during my captivity. They wanted tactical information, details about the ship's weapons systems and crew numbers, and I provided what I could. But the information that felt most important to me, the strange contradiction of kindness and fierce capability that I had witnessed firsthand, did not fit neatly into any category my debriefing officers were prepared to record. I tried, nonetheless, to convey it as clearly as I could, because I believed, even then, that understanding this contradiction was essential to understanding the true nature of the enemy we were facing. I told them that the humans did not fight out of hatred for us, as our own propaganda often suggested. I told them that the kindness I witnessed was not calculated weakness but a genuine expression of values that ran alongside their considerable capacity for violence, not in contradiction to it, but somehow integrated with it, in a way our own culture had no equivalent for. I do not know how much of my report was truly absorbed by those who received it. I know that in the cycles that followed, our overall strategy toward humanity continued to be shaped primarily by tactical and strategic considerations, with little attention paid to the deeper cultural questions I had tried to raise. This, I believe now, was one of our greatest failures throughout the entire conflict, a persistent unwillingness to truly understand the people we were fighting, even as the cost of that misunderstanding grew heavier with every cycle that passed. I think often, even now, so many years later, of Ethan Marlowe's calm explanation for why his crew could laugh and fight with equal intensity. I think of Grace Ellison's gentle care for our wounded technician at Basran Outpost. I think of Voskin Yell's confused gratitude for the treatment he received during our shared captivity. These memories do not fit the narrative of a purely hostile, purely dangerous enemy that so much of our wartime messaging tried to construct. They tell a more complicated story, one that I believe our leadership was never quite willing to fully hear, and one that I have carried with me through everything that came after. The next tale I have to share with you moves away from the battlefield entirely, into the far more delicate arena of diplomacy, where our people attempted, for the first time, to negotiate directly with human representatives in an effort to end the growing conflict before it consumed even more lives on both sides. What happened during that negotiation taught us something about humanity that no battle, however costly, ever fully revealed, and it remains, to this day, one of the most important lessons of the entire war. The negotiation took place nearly 6 cycles after my release from captivity, by which point I had been promoted again, this time to a position within our sector command structure that gave me access to briefings far beyond what a typical officer of my rank would normally see. I was not a diplomat myself, but I was assigned as a military advisor to the delegation our government sent to meet with human representatives at a neutral station situated in disputed territory between our respective zones of control. Our leadership entered these negotiations with what I now recognize as a deeply flawed understanding of what we were about to encounter. The delegation's senior diplomat, an experienced negotiator named Torvain Kess, had spent his career mediating disputes between various species within our own sphere of influence, all of whom operated according to a set of unspoken but widely understood rules governing how leverage and concession worked in formal negotiation. He expected humans, despite everything we had learned about them on the battlefield, to approach this meeting according to similar principles. I remember the briefing before we departed, where Torvain outlined his strategy for the negotiation. He intended to open with a demonstration of our continued military strength in the region, followed by a carefully calibrated offer of territorial concessions designed to appear generous while actually preserving our most valuable strategic assets. This was, by his own admission, a fairly standard approach, one that had served him well in dozens of previous negotiations with other species throughout our history of expansion. I expressed some reservation about this approach during the briefing, drawing on what I had learned during my captivity about the fundamentally different way humans seem to approach conflict and cooperation. Torvain listened politely but ultimately dismissed my concerns, noting that negotiation was a different arena from combat, governed by its own logic that he was confident would apply regardless of the species involved. I did not press the issue further, though I carried a growing unease with me as we traveled toward the neutral station where the meeting would take place. The human delegation that greeted us upon our arrival was smaller than I expected, led by a woman named Claire Bennett, who held a position within human governance that our translators struggled to fully categorize, something between a military commander and a civilian administrator, a combination of roles that did not map cleanly onto any structure we were familiar with. She was accompanied by only a handful of advisors, a stark contrast to the much larger delegation our own government had sent. I remember the opening moments of that first meeting clearly, because they immediately began to unravel everything Torvain had planned. He began, as intended, with a carefully worded reference to our continued military presence in the region, meant to establish a subtle undertone of strength before any substantive discussion began. Claire Bennett listened to this opening with what appeared to be genuine attentiveness, and when he finished, she responded not with the defensive posturing he expected, but with a direct and almost disarmingly honest acknowledgement. She said that she understood the reference to our military presence, and that she wanted to be equally direct in return. She informed our delegation, in the same calm and measured tone I remembered from my own experience among human crew members, that human forces had already secured control over 3 supply routes our fleet depended on for operations throughout the sector. an action that had apparently been completed in the days immediately preceding this very meeting, without any of our intelligence networks detecting it in advance. I watched Torvain's composure falter, just slightly, as he processed this information. It was delivered not as a threat, not with any hint of triumph or aggression, but simply as a fact relevant to the discussion at hand, something Claire Bennett clearly believed both sides needed to understand clearly before any meaningful negotiation could proceed. She followed this revelation with an explanation of what she called her government's actual position, which was not a demand for surrender or territorial concession in the way our delegation had prepared for, but a genuine proposal for mutual withdrawal from contested regions, accompanied by a framework for future contact that emphasized clear boundaries and mutual respect rather than continued conflict. I remember being struck, in that moment, by the strange combination of qualities Claire Bennett displayed throughout the negotiation. She spoke with what felt like genuine warmth, asking after the well-being of our delegation members, inquiring about the conditions our people were experiencing in the sectors affected by the ongoing conflict, showing what appeared to be authentic concern for suffering on both sides of the war. And yet, interwoven with this warmth, was an unmistakable demonstration of capability and resolve that left no doubt about what would happen if her proposed terms were rejected. Torvain attempted, over the following hours of discussion, to employ several of the tactical approaches that had served him well in previous negotiations. He tried introducing artificial deadlines to pressure quick concessions. Claire Bennett responded by patiently explaining that her government was prepared to continue discussions for as long as necessary to reach a genuinely stable agreement, and that rushed decisions born of artificial pressure tended to produce fragile outcomes that ultimately served no one's interests. He tried suggesting that continued conflict would prove more costly to humanity than to our own forces, hoping to leverage this claim into further concessions. She responded with a calm, detailed accounting of human production capacity and military readiness that made clear, without any hint of aggression in her tone, that this particular pressure point simply did not exist in the way our intelligence had assumed. I remember, during a break in the formal proceedings, having a brief and unexpected conversation with one of Claire Bennett's advisors, a quiet man named Daniel Hargrove, who had said very little during the main negotiation, but had clearly been listening closely to every exchange. He approached me during this break, apparently recognizing something in my demeanor that suggested I held a different perspective from the rest of our delegation, perhaps sensing, correctly, that I had spent time among human crew members during my earlier captivity. He asked me, with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than any strategic purpose, how our side viewed this entire conflict. I found myself answering honestly, describing the confusion and growing unease that had spread through our fleet in the cycles since our first encounters with humanity, the way our traditional understanding of strength and weakness, of when to fight and when to retreat, had been repeatedly challenged and ultimately proven inadequate against a species that seemed to operate according to entirely different principles. Daniel listened carefully to everything I said, and then offered a perspective that has stayed with me ever since. He said that humanity had not sought this conflict, and that his people generally preferred to resolve disputes without resorting to violence whenever possible. But he said that once conflict became unavoidable, his people had learned, through their own difficult history long before humanity ever reached the stars, that half measures and hesitation tended to prolong suffering rather than prevent it. He said that the same crews who fought with the intensity we had witnessed on the battlefield were, in nearly every case, the same individuals who genuinely wanted peace and stability, not because these things were contradictory, but because they understood something our own culture had perhaps never fully grasped, that the willingness to fight fully when necessary and the genuine desire for peace could exist within the same person without any contradiction at all. I did not fully understand this explanation in the moment, and I confess I am still working through its full implications even now, so many years later. But I remember the negotiation concluding, after nearly a full week of discussion, with an agreement that was far more favorable to our side than Torvain had believed possible after that first unsettling exchange. Claire Bennett's government, it became clear as discussions progressed, genuinely wanted a stable resolution that would allow both sides to withdraw from active hostility, not because they lacked the capability to continue pressing their advantage, but because continued conflict served no purpose once a workable framework for peaceful coexistence had been established. This, I have come to believe, represents one of the most important and least understood truths about the entire war we fought against humanity. Our leadership, throughout the conflict, operated under the assumption that any species capable of the military dominance humanity repeatedly demonstrated must inevitably seek to expand that dominance as far as circumstances allowed, following the same pattern of conquest and expansion that had defined our own history and the history of nearly every other species we had previously encountered. Humanity did not follow this pattern, and our repeated failure to understand why cost us dearly throughout the conflict. Prolonging hostilities long after a genuine and lasting peace could have been achieved if our leadership had simply been willing to trust what the humans themselves were telling us, plainly and repeatedly, throughout every interaction we had with them. The agreement reached during that negotiation did not end the broader conflict entirely, as I will describe in the tales that follow, but it did establish a framework that would eventually prove essential to the eventual resolution of the war, years later, after far more suffering had occurred than needed to. I have often wondered, in the quiet moments of my long retirement, how different the outcome might have been if our leadership had listened more carefully to what Claire Bennett and her advisors tried to communicate during that first significant negotiation, and how many lives, on both sides, might have been preserved if the lesson had been learned sooner, rather than only after years of continued and largely unnecessary conflict. I remember Torvain Kess, in the aftermath of that negotiation, admitting to me privately that he had never encountered a negotiating counterpart quite like Claire Bennett, someone who combined genuine warmth and apparent concern for the well-being of an adversary with an unmistakable and unwavering resolve that left absolutely no room for the kind of manipulation his career had been built upon. He said, and I have never forgotten this admission, that he did not believe our people fully understood what we were dealing with, even after everything we had already learned on the battlefield, and that he feared it would take far more loss before that understanding finally took root at the highest levels of our government. His fear, unfortunately, proved well-founded. The tale I will share with you next describes what happened when that lesson was finally and unavoidably driven home, at a small and largely unremarkable outpost that would later become known throughout our entire military history as the place where the true scope of what we were facing against humanity could no longer be denied or minimized by anyone, regardless of their rank or their stubborn attachment to the assumptions that had guided our species for so many generations before that fateful encounter. The place was called HFY Reach, a small forward garrison situated on a rocky world at the very edge of territory that both our forces and humanity had, until that point, largely avoided direct confrontation over. I was present during this engagement, not as a combatant, but as an observer, attached to a larger fleet command structure, tasked with reporting directly to sector leadership on the effectiveness of new tactical doctrines we had developed in response to everything learned from earlier encounters throughout the conflict. The garrison at HFY Reach was held by a small human contingent, no more than 40 individuals by our best intelligence estimates, supported by minimal fortifications and a handful of defensive systems that seemed almost negligible compared to the force our command had assembled to remove them from what we considered a strategically important position. Our fleet commander for this operation, a determined and highly experienced officer named Calthus Draven, had studied every previous engagement with humanity extensively, and believed, with genuine confidence born of careful preparation, rather than the arrogance that had doomed earlier commanders, that overwhelming force, combined with careful tactical patience, would finally allow us to achieve a decisive victory. I remember the scale of the force assembled for this operation, easily the largest deployment against a single human position that our sector had ever attempted. Commander Calthus intended to surround the garrison completely, cutting off any possibility of retreat or reinforcement, before conducting a slow and methodical assault designed to minimize our own losses, while gradually overwhelming the defenders through sheer persistence and superior numbers. The initial phase of the operation proceeded largely as planned. Our forces established a complete perimeter around HFY Reach within the first day, and Commander Calthus's careful reconnaissance confirmed that no reinforcement fleet was within range to assist the beleaguered garrison. By any reasonable military calculation, the human position at HFY Reach was hopeless. facing certain defeat against a force many times its size, with no possibility of relief. I remember the confidence in Commander Kalthus's voice during our briefings in those early hours, a confidence I found myself sharing, cautiously, given everything I had personally witnessed and learned about human capabilities throughout the preceding cycles. Perhaps, I remember thinking, this would finally be the engagement where our numbers and our careful preparation would prove decisive, where the lessons learned from Farai Hollow and Basran Outpost and my own captivity would finally translate into the kind of victory our command structure had been seeking since this entire conflict began. I was wrong, and I remember the exact moment I understood how deeply wrong I had been. As our forces began the methodical assault Commander Kalthus had planned, gradually tightening the perimeter around Farai Reach, while minimizing exposure to the garrison's limited defensive capabilities, something began to happen that none of our extensive preparation had accounted for. The human defenders, rather than growing more desperate and less effective as their situation deteriorated, as our doctrine assumed any rational defending force would, instead, began adapting their tactics in ways that grew steadily more sophisticated and more difficult to counter with each passing hour. I remember watching, through the tactical displays available to me as an observer, as small teams of defenders began conducting what could only be described as counter-raids against our besieging forces, striking at specific points in our perimeter, with a precision that suggested they had identified weaknesses in our formation that our own commanders had not yet recognized. These were not desperate, suicidal sallies born of hopelessness. They were calculated strikes, each one achieving specific tactical objectives before withdrawing back to the garrison's defenses, gradually eroding our numerical advantage through a slow and patient campaign of attrition that seemed to grow more effective the longer the siege continued. Commander Kalthus adjusted our tactics repeatedly in response, and I want to be clear that his adaptations were intelligent and well-reasoned, drawing on everything our sector had learned throughout the conflict. Each adjustment, however, seemed to be anticipated and countered by the defenders within Farai Reach almost as quickly as we could implement it, as if they were somehow staying one step ahead of our own tactical evolution throughout the entire engagement. I remember a conversation with Commander Kalthus during a rare, quiet moment on the third day of the siege, when the toll of the engagement had already grown far beyond what our initial projections had suggested. He confided in me, with a level of honesty I had not expected from someone in his position, that he was beginning to understand something about human military doctrine that troubled him deeply. He said that our own forces, and indeed every other species we had previously encountered throughout our history of expansion, tended to fight most effectively when circumstances favored them, and tended to grow less effective, more prone to error and hesitation, as their situation deteriorated and hope of victory diminished. Humanity, he said, seemed to operate according to the exact opposite principle. The worse their circumstances became, the more precise and effective their responses grew, as if desperation itself served as a kind of catalyst that sharpened rather than dulled their capabilities. This was, he admitted, a pattern that our own military doctrine had no established framework for countering, because it violated a fundamental assumption that had guided strategic thinking throughout every conflict our species had ever fought before encountering humanity. The siege of Farai Reach continued for nearly 2 full weeks, far longer than any of our commanders had anticipated when the operation began. Our losses, though never approaching the scale of a true defeat given our overwhelming numerical advantage, grew steadily heavier with each passing day, a slow and grinding attrition that stood in stark contrast to the decisive victory Commander Kalthus had initially envisioned. The garrison's defenders, meanwhile, continued their pattern of calculated resistance, striking when opportunities presented themselves and withdrawing before we could bring our full force to bear, adapting continuously to every change in our approach, with a speed that seemed almost impossible given their limited numbers and resources. I remember, during the final days of the siege, intercepting communications from within the garrison that offered a rare glimpse into how the defenders themselves understood their increasingly dire situation. I heard voices coordinating defensive actions with the same calm precision I had come to expect from every human encounter throughout the conflict, giving instructions and updates without any hint of the panic or despair our own doctrine would have predicted from a force facing near certain defeat. I also heard, once again, that strange and unsettling pattern that had followed me throughout this entire war, Brief moments of what could only be described as genuine humor and camaraderie shared between voices, even in the midst of what was clearly an increasingly desperate defense. I remember hearing a woman's voice, calm and steady, making what sounded like a joke about the quality of their remaining provisions, followed by quiet laughter from several others nearby, before the conversation shifted seamlessly back to coordinating the defense of a critical section of their perimeter. The siege ultimately ended not through a decisive military breakthrough, but through a negotiated withdrawal, arranged after Sector Command, having received Commander Kalthus's increasingly concerned reports throughout the engagement, made the difficult decision that the cost of continuing the siege had grown disproportionate to whatever strategic value HFY Reach actually held for our broader war effort. The garrison's defenders were permitted to withdraw with their equipment intact, a resolution that Commander Kalthus, despite the enormous resources our side had invested in the operation, ultimately came to view as the wisest available choice, given everything we had learned throughout those difficult 2 weeks. I remember the final briefing Commander Kalthus gave to Sector Command upon the conclusion of the engagement, a briefing I was present for given my role as an observer throughout the entire siege. He spoke with a candor that I believe took many of the senior officers present by surprise, describing in detail how thoroughly our extensive preparation and numerical superiority had been neutralized by an opponent who seemed to grow more capable rather than less as circumstances turned against them. He offered a conclusion that I have carried with me ever since, one that I believe captures something essential about the entire war we fought against humanity, more clearly than perhaps any other single observation made throughout the whole conflict. He said that our species, throughout our long history of expansion and conquest, had built our entire military doctrine around the assumption that desperation weakens a fighting force, that hope of victory is what sustains effective resistance, and that this assumption had proven not merely inaccurate, but dangerously inverted when applied to humanity. He said that for reasons our own culture struggled to fully comprehend, humans seemed to draw strength precisely from circumstances that would break the resolve of almost any other species, treating even the most dire situations not as cause for despair, but as simply another problem to be solved with whatever resources and ingenuity remained available to them. I have thought about this conclusion many times in the years since, turning it over in my mind alongside everything else I had witnessed throughout the conflict, from the calm voice on that very first channel to the strange laughter that seemed to follow every human engagement I encountered or heard about, to the genuine warmth Claire Bennett had shown during our negotiation, even while demonstrating an unmistakable and unwavering resolve. I believe now that Commander Kalthus had identified, at HFY Reach, the single most important truth about the enemy we had spent so many cycles fighting without ever fully understanding, a truth that would ultimately shape how the entire war finally came to its conclusion. The final tale I have to share with you brings this long account to its close, describing not a single battle or negotiation, but the broader resolution of the entire conflict, and the difficult lessons our people were finally forced to accept about the true nature of the species we had, through our own arrogance and misunderstanding, transformed from a distant and largely unknown people into the most formidable adversary our dominion had ever faced, across the entire span of our long and, until that point, largely triumphant history among the stars. I am an old man now, by the measure of my own people, and the war I have spent these many hours describing to you ended a long time ago, resolved not through the total victory either side had once imagined possible, but through a slow and difficult process of mutual understanding that took far longer to achieve than it ever needed to, had our leadership been willing to learn the lessons that were offered to us so clearly and so repeatedly throughout every single encounter I have described in this account. The final resolution of the conflict came gradually, over the course of several years following the siege of HFY Reach, as sector commanders throughout our dominion began, one by one, to reach the same difficult conclusions that Commander Kalthus had voiced so candidly in his final briefing. The pattern had become impossible to ignore by that point. Every engagement with humanity, regardless of the specific tactical circumstances, followed the same fundamental shape. We would enter each encounter with confidence born of our numerical or technological advantage, and we would emerge from it having learned, at often considerable cost, that these advantages meant far less against humanity than they had against every other species we had previously encountered throughout our long history of expansion. I was present, in the later years of my career, for many of the diplomatic exchanges that gradually built toward a lasting resolution between our two peoples. I remember these negotiations bearing little resemblance to that first difficult meeting with Claire Bennett so many years earlier, largely because our own delegations had finally begun to approach these discussions with the understanding that direct honesty and genuine respect, rather than calculated maneuvering, represented the only path toward an agreement that humanity would actually consider stable and worth honoring over the long term. I remember, during one of the later negotiations I attended, finally asking a question that had followed me throughout the entire conflict, a question I posed to a human diplomat named Owen Sinclair, who had by then become a familiar and respected presence in the ongoing discussions between our two peoples. I asked him, as directly as I could manage, what humanity had actually wanted from this entire conflict, given that every engagement had demonstrated capabilities that could have, had humanity chosen to pursue more aggressive strategic objectives, likely secured far greater territorial and political concessions than what our eventual agreements actually provided. Owen considered the question carefully before answering, and his response has remained with me ever since, as perhaps the clearest explanation I ever received for everything I had witnessed throughout the war. He said that humanity had never sought to conquer or dominate our dominion, despite having demonstrated, repeatedly and at great cost to both sides, that such conquest may well have been within their capability had they chosen to pursue it fully. He said that what humanity actually wanted, from the very beginning of this unfortunate conflict, was simply to be left alone to determine their own future, and to be treated with the same basic respect that any people, regardless of their technological development or military strength, deserved from their neighbors among the stars. He explained that humanity's approach to the conflict, the fierce resistance, combined with the genuine warmth I had witnessed so many times throughout my own experiences, reflected a broader philosophy that had shaped human civilization long before they ever achieved space travel. A belief that peace was always preferable to conflict, but that the price of maintaining peace sometimes required a willingness to resist aggression fully and without hesitation, precisely because half measures and hesitant responses tended to invite further aggression rather than discourage it. I remember reflecting on this explanation for a long time afterward, turning it over alongside everything I had personally witnessed throughout the war, from Nora Whitfield's calm warning at that very first encounter, through the fierce and costly resistance at Farai Hollow, through the strange and unsettling discovery at Basran Outpost, through my own captivity, and the genuine kindness I received from Ethan Marlowe and his crew, through Claire Bennett's remarkable combination of warmth and unwavering resolve, through the grinding and ultimately humbling siege at Farai Reach. Every single one of these experiences, viewed through the lens of Owen's explanation, suddenly seemed to form a coherent and consistent pattern, one that our leadership had simply been too proud, for too long, to recognize clearly. Our dominion, throughout our long history of expansion, had never truly encountered a species that fought this way, that combined such formidable capability with such genuine restraint, that seemed entirely willing to inflict whatever cost was necessary to preserve their independence, while showing no interest whatsoever in expanding beyond what they considered their own rightful territory. We had spent generations conquering and absorbing species that either could not effectively resist us, or that, once defeated, could be reasonably incorporated into our broader dominion structure. Humanity fit neither category, and our repeated failure to recognize this fundamental difference, even after encounter demonstrated it clearly, prolonged a conflict that ultimately served the interests of neither side. The formal agreements that eventually ended active hostility between our two peoples were, in the end, remarkably straightforward. Once our leadership finally approached the negotiations with the honesty and respect that Claire Bennett and her successors had consistently modeled throughout every discussion, clear boundaries were established, respected by both sides in the years that followed, with a consistency that surprised many within our own government, who had grown accustomed to the more fluid and often contested borders typical of relations between species within our own historical sphere of influence. Trade and limited diplomatic exchange gradually developed in the years after the formal resolution, built on a foundation of mutual respect that neither side seemed inclined to test or violate, a stability that stood in stark contrast to the constant tension and periodic conflict that had characterized so many of our other interspecies relationships throughout our long history. I retired from active service not long after the final resolution was formally established, choosing to spend the remaining years of my career in a role that allowed me to help train younger officers in the lessons our entire Dominion had learned, at such considerable cost, throughout the conflict with humanity. I have spent many years now sharing these stories with new generations of officers and cadets, hoping that the difficult lessons I witnessed firsthand might help our people avoid repeating the same mistakes should we ever encounter another species whose fundamental nature differs so significantly from what our history had prepared us to expect. The lesson I try hardest to convey, whenever I share these tales, is not simply a tactical or strategic one, though there is certainly much of practical value that can be learned from studying the specific engagements I have described throughout this account. The deeper lesson, the one I believe matters most, is about the danger of assuming that every species we encounter must necessarily share our own fundamental values and motivations. That strength must always translate into a desire for expansion and dominance. That kindness and ferocity cannot coexist within the same people without one eventually overwhelming the other. Humanity taught our entire civilization, through years of costly and largely unnecessary conflict, that these assumptions were not universal truths, but simply the limited perspective of a species that had never before encountered a people capable of holding such apparent contradictions in perfect and unshakable balance. They taught us that a species could be simultaneously the most dangerous adversary we had ever faced and the most genuinely decent one, that fierce resistance and authentic warmth were not opposing forces, but simply two expressions of the same underlying commitment to protecting what they valued most. I think, often, of that very first encounter I witnessed as a young officer, standing on the bridge of the Vantel Rest, watching Commander Draveth's confidence crumble in the face of a single calm voice that refused to be intimidated by our overwhelming force. I did not understand in that moment that I was witnessing the opening scene of a conflict that would fundamentally reshape everything my people believed about our place in the galaxy. I understand it now, with the clarity that only many years of reflection can provide, and I hope that by sharing these tales with you, whoever you may be listening to this account so many years after these events took place, some small measure of that understanding might be preserved for whatever challenges your own generation may eventually face among the stars. The galaxy did not end, as some of my younger colleagues feared it might during the darkest days of our conflict with humanity. Instead, it changed, gradually and permanently, into something that included, for the first time in our long history, a genuine partner among the stars, rather than simply another species to be conquered or absorbed. I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between our peoples, whether the peace we ultimately achieved will endure for generations to come, or whether new tensions will eventually emerge to test it once again. But I know, with a certainty that has only grown stronger throughout my many years of reflection, that whatever challenges lie ahead, the lessons I have shared with you today, hard-won through so much unnecessary conflict, will remain essential to navigating them wisely. This is my account, offered honestly and completely, of the chilling tales I witnessed while fighting against humanity, and of the profound and lasting understanding that emerged, against all expectation, from the ashes of that long and difficult war.